he is the 35th richest person in the country. Forbes calls him the 7th most powerful person on the planet. A college dropout from Dobbs Ferry, New York, he was labeled Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2010. All of this at the ripe old age of 26. For those of you who can't guess who I'm talking about, his name is Mark Zuckerberg, and he wants to know everything about you. To him, the real world is outdated. To him, privacy is a thing of the past, and relationships built in the physical universe will quickly be supplanted by the relationships we build with people over our internet connections. Those cynics would say he just wants your entire existence uploaded to cyberspace so he can monetize your life story. I tend to think he honestly believes that a world where there is no privacy and where all connections are made digitally would be a positive one. Regardless of who's correct, he has certainly assumed the role of moral figurehead for a movement of social entrepreneurs who deride privacy as an outdated and unnecessary means of control and restriction. Since the rise of Facebook, billions of dollars have been poured into companies charged with the virtuous task of facilitating great action and collaboration between ourselves and our friends, family, relatives, and even people who are complete strangers. This movement, though quixotic in its goals, strikes me as a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, breaking down the social barriers that divide us can be incredibly positive. Less privacy means more accountability. It means people will think a lot harder before doing something that could end up on Facebook or Twitter or one of the other social networks, only to be discovered later by a potential employer. The quick dissemination of information means that people will be less likely to do things that could end up online for the world to see. It makes us wonder if David would have engaged in his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba had Facebook been around in his day. Would David have pursued Bathsheba so aggressively if he thought that Uriah would be checking in on her status updates from the battlefield? Would David be so easygoing about ordering Uriah to his death if he thought that WikiLeaks might catch it on tape? Would David be worried about ending up like Muammar Gaddafi if the world saw him order the assassination of one of his generals and then try to cover it up? It's hard to imagine his people not being outraged by that type of behavior. Regardless of whether David would have lost his crown or not, people would be certainly far less willing to go into battle for him, especially if they thought that they could have ended up in Uriah's position. Let's just say that if David were an elected leader, he probably wouldn't consider running for another term. Although hypothetical, this seems to imply that the social movement has achieved its goals. The fear of exposure to the public has probably dissuaded many people from doing things which might ruin their reputations, their careers, and their marriages. So, in a world where there are no secrets, would it be difficult to have an adulterous affair? Probably. So, the move towards more openness and less privacy is all rosy, and there's nothing to worry about, right? Well, not so fast. Let's examine why David has his affair with Bathsheba first. In David's day, for powerful rulers, this probably wasn't as unusual as we would think. Kings always seem to get what they want, even if it meant having a few people assassinated along the way. Ironically, it probably helped their public image more than it hurt it, as men being ruled by a monarch as powerful as David wouldn't want to end up in Uriah's position. After spending so many years having people wait on his every desire, you would see how the power could get to the head of someone even as iron-willed as David. Everything would seem like an object to him, something to be used and then discarded once he was finished. This is how he would classify the people around him as well, from his wives and his generals and his mistresses and ministers. They too were merely objects to him. He wouldn't discard them in a physical sense, but he would simply move on to the next object. There were always lines and lines of people waiting to get closer to David, so the people around him were easily replaceable. And so they really didn't mean much. You could say that having so many people around him made him a very lonely person. We seem to spend our whole lives fighting to be indispensable. We try to impress the teacher so he'll remember us and give us a better grade on the paper. We find a niche skill that only we are good at, so the boss can't afford to lose us. We marry someone who truly wants to spend the rest of their lives with us, so we can know that we are not discardable, that we are not a fling or a phase. Sometimes we've seen entire groups of people rise up and refuse to be dispensable, refuse to be objects. It seems embedded into our culture, the idea that every person has worth and that no one is simply an object to be used and discarded. Herein lies the paradox of the Facebook generation. We are becoming more dispensable, and our connections are more dispensable, so we're really becoming lonelier. For those of you who read The Atlantic, you'll know that there was an interesting article in the May issue which dived into the social networks that surround us today. In the article, the author runs through several studies done by distinguished scientists at various prestigious universities, all trying to discover the same thing: whether Facebook is causing loneliness or whether loneliness is simply extended into Facebook along with the other social networking services. All the scientists agree that we are getting progressively more lonely, but there is contention about whether Facebook is alleviating or elevating the problem or doing nothing at all. The consensus seems to be that Facebook isn't causing additional loneliness, but that lonely individuals in reality will be lonely individuals. In other words, popular people will still be popular, and lonely people will still be lonely. However, the author makes an interesting point when he says that Facebook allows us to connect with one another while avoiding the messiness of human relationships. It is an idealized world where conversations are reduced to status updates and comments, and showing approval is as easy as clicking a button. The best part? All the gooey emotional stuff that comes with forming a bond with another human being can be forgotten and discarded as people merely revel in the obvious hilarity of the 350 new photos that your best friend just posted of her cat doing somersaults. This is leading to an epidemic of what psychologists would refer to as exhibitionism. I, however, tend to think of it more as projecting. You show the world the person you want to be or the person you see yourself as being, not the person you are. We are all guilty of it to some degree, even in the real world. Even if people don't explicitly state to you that you are experiencing symptoms of exhibitionism, you still think very hard about the bands that you put under your favorite music and the people that you put up under your inspirational figures page and the effect this will have on people who peruse your Facebook page for the first time. It's really an extraordinary phenomenon. For people who have never met you before or just met you in passing, you can be anyone you want to be. I could convince my roommate for this upcoming school year that I'm a football player who's into jazz fusion music and loves watching reality television. If you're wondering, one of those things is true, and it's not the one about being a football player. We have to constantly think about the person we want to project to the world and not the person who we truly are. The moments we spend in solitude, away from other people, are wasted trying to craft better versions of ourselves. I think generations will become lonelier than the ones before them, not because we don't go to church as much or we don't eat family dinners more, although these are extremely important, but because we will find it difficult to connect with each other, and not in a literal sense, but in a spiritual sense. I think David worried about his image and probably told himself repeatedly that he had to exude strength and control at all times. I think he was a lonely ruler because he was unable to connect with the people around him on a spiritual level, because people constantly connected with him on a superficial level. People were so enthusiastic to be closer to him and so eager to show him their worth as people, and it was their projections of themselves to him, and likewise his projection of himself to them, that made him an even lonelier person. He was that person on Facebook who has 1,500 friends, and all of them liked every picture he put up and every status update he made, but failed to ever bond with him, and he made no efforts to bond with them. His loneliness and his power drove him to make objects of the people around him, to see them as pieces on a chessboard to be manipulated, rather than human beings with dreams and desires that he had to factor into his decisions. I think this is what drove him to his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, even as he knew the sacrifice that Uriah was making when he went to fight David's wars. I think it's the same thing that drove him to try to cover up the scandal by having Uriah sleep with his own wife so that the public would think that the son he parented with Bathsheba belonged to Uriah and not to him. Him fostering a child with a married woman would not fit into the projection that he wanted the world to see of him. He needed a quick escape route, so he ultimately had Uriah killed so that Bathsheba would no longer be married, and thus his projection, his exhibition, would be upheld. His loneliness and his lack of connection with those around him, with perhaps a touch of narcissism, to understate it, was what allowed him to think that the people around him were controllable and dispensable. In the end, all those Facebook friends were just names on a computer screen. I think my generation is one that is in danger of being chronically lonely. We spend so much time projecting our own image of ourselves to the outside world that it makes it hard for us to trust that the people we meet are truly who they say they are, and not merely who they want people to think they are. It's not distrust in the traditional sense, but more a general distrust of character. This causes us to avoid human relationships, for finding out that someone is something other than what they project themselves to be would force us to evaluate ourselves and come to the painful conclusion that we are not the person that our Facebook friends think we are. Truly bonding with someone is too hard, because it means that we would have to reveal ourselves just as the other person has done, shattering the mirage and ruining the exhibition. For it is spiritual to connect with another human being on a level where you truly know each other. And if you know the story of David and Bathsheba, you'll know that God was none too pleased with David, and the punishments he chose were designed to force David to live with the reality of his actions. For God didn't create us to be lonely creatures. Finding moments of solitude and peace sure seems like it's part of our programming, but we were not built to avoid each other. We were built to connect with each other, and not the way that Mark Zuckerberg is thinking of. In closing, I would like to ask that the parents in the room please not go home and rip the computers out from under the hands of their children and never let them update their Facebook statuses again. For social networks are ultimately just tools, extensions of our own physical networks. Instead, let's encourage each other to change how we use the tools. Let's use our new social connection engines to foster communication and encourage the creation of greater bonds between each other. Let's use the tools to organize and learn, mobilize and communicate. Let's accomplish the mission that the social networks set out to do, break down the barriers that divide us. Maybe one day we will achieve a world where the friendships we make will matter more than the comments we get on our last status update. For now, let's just keep building our own spiritual social network, one friend request at a time. Amen.